Hello everyone, my name is Donna Parker and I want to welcome you to this podcast. Today, in part one of a two-part lecture, I will be talking to you about communication and the growth of mass media. The development of these two areas is important to the ultimate development and purpose of television. After listening to today's lecture, you will be able to identify when communication began, identify when permanent records began being kept, and identify what early interventions were introduced prior to the 1900s. To help you understand the impact of modern-day television, we must first take a look at the past. The journey to where we are today began with the caveman, whose desire to communicate compelled him to draw pictures of his daily life on cave walls. These drawings illustrated the caveman's experiences, and when he and his family moved on, the account of their lives that they created was left behind. Did you know that it wasn't until thousands and thousands of years after the caveman that permanent records containing important historical and cultural information began to be recorded? Around 3000 BC, the Egyptians discovered a way to use reeds from papyrus plants to make paper. With this crude paper to write on, records could now be kept. These records were recorded by hand, and because it was a very slow process, the spread of information was equally as slow, thus bypassing the common man and reaching only the wealthy and those that could afford to pay for it. Over 4,000 years would pass before the next major invention to benefit mankind would be created. Sometime around 1440, a German man named Johannes Gutenberg invented a machine called a printing press. This machine would revolutionize the world because it allowed the printing of books and newspapers in large numbers, making information available to everyone, not just those who could afford to pay for it. No longer would books and manuscripts need to be copied by hand. The new invention would make it easier and faster to communicate with large numbers of people over great distances. By the 1700s, newspapers were used as the major source for spreading information to the public. Although it didn't have a name, this form of disseminating information is what we now call mass media, and it allowed unparalleled numbers of people to know what was happening around the world. By the 1800s, the thirst for knowledge and better means of communicating drove inventors to stretch the limits. Inventions that would quickly speed up the expansion of our world were now being discovered and made available to the masses faster than ever before. In 1837, Samuel Morse patented the telegraph and his Morse code. Now important information could be delivered in hours instead of days. The telegraph even allowed individuals to communicate directly with each other when news about loved ones needed to be shared. Within a few years, in 1839, the first commercial camera was introduced and photography was born. By 1876, Alexander Graham Bell received the patent for the telephone, and this form of communication became popular among families who lived great distances from each other. It was less formal and allowed more personal interaction. This invention would give the telegraph quite a bit of competition in years to come. In 1877, Edison invented the phonograph, a contraption that allowed you to play music from pre-engraved rotating cylinders or discs. This was followed by the kinetograph, the first motion picture camera, in 1892. During the 1890s and the early 1900s, films were very short, some under a minute, others up to 8 minutes long. They were black and white and had no sound. When you went to see a movie, they would often be accompanied by a piano player who played from a score that accompanied the film, or simply made up the music as they watched the show. By the beginning of the 20th century, living in America gave you access to some of the most exciting advances taking place in the world. We could now communicate with each other through pictures, printed words, music, stories that would come to life on the big screen, and the sound of a familiar voice carried over long distances. Americans and the world were primed and ready for what would come next. This ends the first part of a two-part lecture on the history of communication and mass media. Please take a few minutes to look over your notes. When you feel you're ready, proceed to the assessment.